conference room on the 32nd floor smelled like money. Not real money, the kind that comes from working your hands raw for 40 years, but the polished, artificial kind. Leather chairs, fresh flowers. Nobody had picked. A view of downtown Nashville that probably cost more per square foot than my first house. I was sitting on the wrong side of the table. My son-in-law's attorney, a man named Forsyth, sharp suit, sharper eyes, had already looked me over twice since I walked in. The third time, he leaned over to his assistant and said something quietly. She smiled. I heard one word clearly enough. Retired. He said it the way you'd say irrelevant. I kept my hands flat on the table and didn't say anything. I'd driven 3 hours that morning in my '09 Silverado with the cracked dashboard and the heater that only works on the left side. I was wearing the same sport coat I'd worn to my daughter's college graduation 14 years ago. It still fit, more or less. My daughter was sitting 2 seats away from me. She hadn't looked in my direction since we sat down. That was the part that hurt most. Not the attorney. Not the way Forsyth kept checking his watch like this was an inconvenience. It was my daughter, my Renee, sitting there in her silk blouse and her highlights, staring straight ahead like I was furniture. I'd driven 3 hours for this. I'd been driving toward this moment in one way or another for almost 2 years. Let me back up. I spent 37 years working for a mid-sized manufacturing company in Clarksville, Tennessee. Started on the floor as a machinist when I was 22. Worked my way up to plant operations manager. Not glamorous. Not the kind of job people write books about, but honest work, steady work, and by the time I was in my mid-50s, we had the house paid off, a decent retirement account, and a life that felt like something I'd actually built with my own 2 hands. My wife Carol passed in 2017, pancreatic cancer. 11 weeks from diagnosis to the end. The kind of fast that doesn't give you time to prepare, just time to grieve in real time while the person you love is still right there in front of you. After that, I was lost for a while. That's the honest truth. Renee was already living in Nashville by then. She'd moved there in her late 20s, met a man, built a different kind of life. She'd call every Sunday, visited Christmas. We were close enough, I thought. The man she'd built her life with was named Preston Orcott. He ran a real estate development company, the kind that buys old industrial land and turns it into mixed-use communities, condos on top, boutique coffee shops on the bottom, none of it affordable to the people who used to live nearby. He was 41 when I first met him. Firm handshake, good teeth, the easy confidence of someone who had never once doubted that the world was arranged for his benefit. I tried to like him. I really did. Carol had liked him, or at least she'd been kind about it. He makes her happy, she told me once, near the end, when we still had evenings where we could talk about things like that. That's enough. I held on to that for a long time. But after Carol was gone, and the Sundays started feeling longer, and the house started feeling like a place I was just occupying rather than living in, I started paying closer attention to things. The way Preston talked about money, always in terms of leverage, always in terms of what could be extracted from something. The way Renee had slowly changed her opinions about things she used to care about. The way she'd stopped mentioning her old friends. The ones from before Nashville. I didn't say anything. It wasn't my place. Then, about 2.5 years ago, Renee called on a Wednesday, not a Sunday. That was the first thing that was different. "Dad," she said, "Preston and I are separating." I didn't say I saw this coming. I didn't say good. I said, "I'm sorry, sweetheart. What do you need?" What she needed, it turned out, was for me to mind my own business and not make things complicated. Preston's attorney had already contacted her. The terms were more than fair, she said, using language that I recognized as not her own. Preston would keep the development company and its assets. Renee would receive the house, a 5-bedroom in Belmead worth roughly $1.4 million, plus a settlement of $380,000 and no alimony. Their daughter, my granddaughter Maisie, who was 7 at the time, would live primarily with Preston. He has more resources, Renee said. For her schooling, activities, all of that. It makes sense logistically. I held the phone for a moment without saying anything. Renee, I said finally, did you have an attorney look at this? Preston's attorney explained everything. Preston's attorney works for Preston. Dad. Her voice had that careful patience in it, the kind you use with someone you've decided not to argue with. I know you mean well, but this isn't. I just need you to be supportive right now, not analytical. I told her I understood. I told her I loved her. I hung up the phone and sat at my kitchen table for a long time. Then I made some calls. I want to be clear about something. I'm 63 years old. I ran a manufacturing plant for over a decade. I managed budgets, contracts, union negotiations, workers' comp disputes. I'm not a lawyer, but I'm not a fool either. The first call I made was to my old college roommate, a man named Gordy who'd spent his career as a CPA and now did consulting work. I described the terms Renee had been offered. Gordy was quiet for a while. Then he said, "What does the development company actually own?" That was the right question. Preston's company, Alcott's Development Group, had been active for about 12 years. I knew the name. I'd heard it mentioned. But I'd never paid close attention to the details. Renee had always deflected when money came up. Preston preferred to keep business and home life separate, she'd say, and I'd respected that. But a development company that had been operating for 12 years in a hot real estate market like Nashville, doing the kind of large-scale projects Preston described at dinner parties, that wasn't worth a settlement of $380,000 to a spouse who'd been married to its founder for 9 years. It wasn't even close. Gordy pointed me toward public records, property filings, LLCs registered with the state. I spent 3 evenings at my kitchen table with reading glasses and a yellow legal pad, going through what I could find. What I found was a structure, a complicated one. Alcott Development Group was the public face, but beneath it were 7 separate LLCs, registered in Tennessee, Delaware, and Wyoming. The properties they held were transferred between these entities at values that didn't match anything I could find in comparable sales. 2 of the LLCs had listed managers whose names I didn't recognize. One of those names turned up when I searched carefully enough as a registered agent for a holding company in the Cayman Islands. I'm not a forensic accountant. I couldn't prove anything with what I had, but I knew enough to know that what Renee had been offered was not more than fair. It was a controlled exit, a way of getting her signature on papers before she understood what she was signing away. I drove to Nashville the next weekend. I didn't tell Renee I was coming. I took her to lunch at a place she'd liked years ago, before Preston had introduced her to restaurants where the menu doesn't have prices. I paid in cash. I put my legal pad on the table. She looked at it. She looked at me. "Dad, I told you." "I know what you told me," I said. "Just look at it for 5 minutes. That's all I'm asking." She looked at it for more than 5 minutes. By the end of lunch, she was crying quietly in a way I hadn't seen since she was a teenager. Not upset crying. Scared crying. The kind that comes when you realize the ground under your feet isn't what you thought it was. The next 6 months were the longest of my life since the weeks after Carol died. Renee agreed to hire her own attorney, a woman named Ackerman, civil litigation, who had handled complex divorce cases for 20 years. I paid the retainer, $50,000 from my retirement savings. People who heard about it later asked if I hesitated. I didn't hesitate for 1 second. Ackerman was thorough. She brought in a forensic accountant, a man named Strickland, who had done work for the Tennessee Attorney General's office before going private. Strickland spent 11 weeks going through Alcott Development Group's financials. What he found was significantly worse than what I'd found at my kitchen table. The short version, Preston had been systematically undervaluing company assets in anticipation of the divorce for at least 18 months before he told Renee he wanted to separate. Properties were transferred to subsidiary LLCs at 30 to 40 cents on the dollar. Cash distributions were rerouted through the Cayman Holding Company. On paper, Alcott Development Group was worth roughly $2.1 million. Strickland's assessment put the actual value at closer to $14 million. The settlement Renee had been offered, the one that was more than fair, represented a recovery of about 1/30th of what she was actually owed. Ackerman filed for full financial disclosure and subpoenaed records from 7 entities. Preston's legal team fought every step. There were motions and counter-motions and delays. Ackerman told us this was standard. They were burning time, hoping Renee would get tired or run out of money. She didn't get tired. I made sure she didn't run out of money. But the part that nobody tells you about situations like this, the part that doesn't show up in legal summaries, is what it does to a family while it's happening. Renee and Preston had agreed on a temporary custody arrangement while the divorce was pending. Maisie was with Preston most of the time. He was careful about it. Never said anything overtly negative about Renee in front of Maisie. But he had resources and he had time, and he had a way of positioning himself as the stable one, the consistent one, while Renee was caught up in conflict. I drove to Nashville 6 times in 8 months. Not for meetings, not for anything official. Just to be there. To take Maisie to get ice cream when it was my weekend with her. To sit at Renee's kitchen table on Tuesday nights when she couldn't sleep and talk about nothing in particular, until she felt steadier. Preston's attorney at one point filed a motion suggesting that my involvement in the litigation was financially coercive and was unduly influencing Renee's decision-making. The motion went nowhere, but I heard about it. Forsyth's name was on the filing. The same Forsyth who was now sitting across from me in this conference room, checking his watch. The meeting had been called to discuss a proposed settlement revision. Ackerman had submitted a counteroffer based on Strickland's valuation, a revised property division plus a child support arrangement that reflected Preston's actual income rather than the suppressed numbers he'd been presenting. It was a reasonable offer. It was the kind of offer that should have ended things. Preston had rejected it. He'd countered with a number that was slightly higher than his original offer, an attempt to appear reasonable while still keeping Renee away from any real share of what the company was worth. Ackerman hadn't been able to attend this meeting. A court conflict. She'd briefed me thoroughly and told me I could sit in as Renee's family support, but that Renee's associate attorney, a younger man named Walters, would be handling the discussion. Renee hadn't wanted me there at all. We'd argued about it the night before on the phone. She said I was making things more complicated. I said I'd driven 3 hours. She said that wasn't the point. I said I knew it wasn't the point. In the end, she'd said fine, I could come, but I needed to let Walters handle it and not say anything. I told her I understood. So I was sitting there, hands flat on the table, watching Forsyth talk. He had a way of speaking that made everything sound settled already. Like the only real question was how quickly Renee would accept the inevitable. He kept calling the proposed settlement the practical path forward. He used the word pragmatic 4 times in 10 minutes. Walters was doing his best. He was thorough, professional, but he was 29 years old and Forsyth had been doing this for 30 years. At one point, Forsyth had gestured toward me, not looking at me directly, but making me part of a sentence, and said that it was admirable that Renee had family members invested in her well-being, but that prolonging the process wasn't ultimately serving anyone, particularly not the daughter. Renee flinched slightly. I saw it. Walters started to respond. I touched his arm once. He stopped. "Mr. Forsyth," I said. Everyone at the table looked at me. Forsyth's expression was politely patient. The kind of patient that isn't really patient at all. "I want to ask you something," I said. "You've been doing family law for, 30 years?" 32, he said. 32 years. That's good. I ran a manufacturing plant for 20. Union shop. Multi-site by the end. I spent a long time negotiating with people who were very good at making bad deals look reasonable. I paused. I got better at recognizing it than I ever wanted to be. Forsyth's expression shifted slightly, just slightly. Mister, my nephew stood in wrong and told me the bank was foreclosing on my house 67 years old at Beckett. And before we continue, I'd like to understand something clearly. I set a folder on the table. Not a thick folder, just 12 pages that Strickland had flagged as his clearest examples. The 3 property transfers that were most obviously inconsistent, the routing summary for the Cayman entity, and 2 years of Preston's personal tax returns showing a lifestyle that couldn't be supported by the income he'd reported in his disclosure. Your client's attorneys told my daughter this settlement was fair, I said. I'd like to know which valuation of Alcott Development Group that figure was based on, because Mr. Strickland's analysis found a discrepancy of approximately $12 million between what was disclosed and what was actually there. And if Mr. Forsyth can point me to the line in those records that accounts for the difference, I'll sit back down and be quiet. The room was very still. Forsyth looked at the folder. He looked at his assistant. He looked briefly at Renee, who was staring at me now, and whose expression I couldn't quite read. Then he looked at me. I think, he said slowly, we may need to take a brief recess. The recess lasted 40 minutes. When Forsyth came back in, he didn't look at his watch again. He sat down carefully, and he placed his own folder on the table, and he said that his client was open to a more comprehensive review of the asset disclosures. He didn't use the word pragmatic again. What came out of the next 6 weeks, because nothing in law happens quickly, was a revised settlement that Ackerman, when she saw it, described as substantially better. Renee received a share of the development company's actual value, property, accounts, equity stakes. The final number was closer to $4 million than to $380,000. Primary custody of Maisie went to Renee with generous visitation for Preston. Maisie came home. I drove back to Clarksville that evening on I-24 with the windows down even though it was cold. I had the radio on. An oldies station out of Nashville that was playing stuff from the 70s, music Carol and I had danced to when we were young and had no idea what the next 40 years would look like. I didn't cry. I'd done my crying in the weeks after Carol died, and then quietly in the months since, late at night in the house that was too big and too quiet. I just drove. I let the cold air in. I thought about Maisie, who'd called me Grandpa Howie since she first tried to say my name and couldn't manage the R. I thought about Renee, who'd called me that night before I even reached the county line, and who hadn't said much, just, "Thank you, Dad." Just that. 2 words. The kind of 2 words that hold 40 years in them. People have asked me since then whether I was angry at Renee, for trying to shut me out of it, for sitting in that conference room and not looking at me. The honest answer is no, not for a moment. She was scared. She'd spent 9 years building a life around a man who turned out to be somebody she didn't fully know. She was protecting herself the only way she knew how, by making herself smaller, by accepting the terms given to her, by not asking too many questions. That's not weakness. That's what people do when they're trying to survive something. What I could do, what I was actually good for at 63 with my Cracks dashboard and my old sport coat and a legal pad full of notes, was ask the questions she wasn't in a position to ask herself. That's what fathers are for. That's what I think anyway. I talked to Strickland after it was all over. He told me that the discrepancies I'd found on my kitchen table had been enough, not to win anything, but to point in the right direction. He said he'd seen these structures before. Money moved between shell companies to minimize a marital estate before a split. Said it was more common than people knew. What made you look in the first place? He asked me. I thought about it. My nephew stood my living room, and told me the bank was foreclosing up at Sinclair. And the actual thing. She'd said that to me once about a truck I was thinking of buying. I don't think she meant it to cover everything. But she was usually right, and I'd learned to listen. Maisie is 9 now. She comes up to Clarksville some weekends. Her and Renee both. We sit on the porch in the evening, and she tells me about school and about the book she's reading and about the rabbit her class adopted that she thinks should be named something different than what it's named. She's got Carol's eyes. Same shade, same directness. The kind that looks at you like it's already decided whether you're worth trusting. I'd like to think she decided yes. The old sport coat is hanging in the closet. I might wear it again someday. It still fits. I've thought a lot about that conference room, the flowers nobody picked, the way Forsyth said the word retired like it settled something. Here's what I know after 63 years. The people who underestimate you are usually doing it because it's convenient for them. It costs them nothing to assume you don't understand what's happening. And if you let them keep assuming that if you stay quiet at the right moment, for the right reason, they will walk themselves right off the edge without any help from you. Preston's entire strategy depended on Renee not asking questions, and on me being exactly what I look like, an old man in an old jacket with no real power in the room. He wasn't wrong about the jacket. But I'd spent 11 weeks at a kitchen table going through LLCs and property transfers and routing statements. I'd paid a forensic accountant out of my retirement savings because I knew what something looked like when it wasn't worth what someone was telling you it was worth. That's not luck. That's just paying attention over a long time and being willing to do the unglamorous work when it matters. Carol used to say that knowing things is only half of it. The other half is being willing to act on what you know, even when acting is uncomfortable, even when the people you love are asking you to stay out of it. Renee told me not to come. She told me to let it go. I understood why she said that. She was scared. And when you're scared, you want to make the target on your back smaller, not bigger. But I also knew that if I stayed home, nobody else was going to put those 12 pages on that table. That was just the truth of it. I think about what it actually took to get to that room. Not the legal work. Ackerman and Strickland did the legal work. I mean what it took before any of that. It took being willing to tell my daughter something she didn't want to hear over lunch, knowing she might not speak to me for a week afterward. It took writing a $50,000 check without flinching because some things you don't calculate. It took 6 drives to Nashville for no official reason, just to sit at a kitchen table on Tuesday nights and be a steady presence while everything around Renee was uncertain. None of that is dramatic. None of it makes a good story on its own, but that's what integrity actually looks like in practice. Not the big moment, but the accumulation of smaller decisions to keep showing up, to keep asking the uncomfortable question, to refuse to let someone you love sign away what's rightfully hers just because the other side is betting on her exhaustion. Maisie's home now. That's the thing I come back to. She's 9 years old and she calls me Grandpa Howie. And she sits on my porch and tells me about the rabbit her class named wrong. That happened because somebody decided to look closely at something, and then decided to act on what they saw, and then didn't stop when it got hard. I'm not telling you I did everything right. I pushed when maybe I should have been gentler. I scared Renee before I helped her. But I showed up, and in the end, showing up with your eyes open and your work done and your hands steady is usually enough. It was enough this time.